Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Galen Clavio, this time coming from live from the Sport Marketing Association.
Live.
Well, we're not live. We're live. You're not hearing us live, but we're in the same location,
That's
which
right.
is awesome. And today we're going to talk a little bit on the Prof Talk Pod about course evaluations and why we need to care about them and ways that can help you kind of connect with your students to get them to fill them out. And I want to start by talking just a little bit about the first time I read my course evaluations. Nobody really prepared me for not being a good teacher right away. I guess I loved teaching and I felt really good about the training I got at KU. And so I was feeling pretty good about my process. And I got those first teaching evaluations and I opened them up and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm the worst teacher ever. I look at the numbers and they're below a 4, which everybody had told me in the department, like nobody gets below a 4 on a 5 scale. But here I am at like 3.8, 3.7. I'm reading the comments and they were like, Dr. Aiken means well, but,
That's the kiss of death right there.
Correct. It's like they don't dislike you as a person, but. And I wasn't adequately prepared for what that would feel like. And I definitely should have had a bottle of wine, which is now my general rule.
Of course.
When looking at course evaluations. But I think part of the problem for me was I was viewing course evaluations as a way to evaluate whether or not I was a good teacher and not as a way of formative feedback to help me become a better teacher. And so I was putting so much of my self-worth into these comments that, I had some control over. But let's be honest, like even if you do all the great things, like you're still going to have people who don't like what you do. It's just like anything, you can't reach everybody. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about it today, just because one, I think there's some things we can do to reduce that feeling and reframe how we think about student evaluations. I'm sure Galen's have always been amazing.
Well, I mean, no. So one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is that for most academics, this is their least favorite part of the job. Not necessarily the teaching, but the getting judged by people anonymously on their teaching. And most people are not born as good teachers. Like you don't come out of the womb or you don't come out of high school or out of college being like, I'm going to go talk in front of a bunch of people. There's a few people that do that. And this is where, it's funny you say like my teaching evaluations have probably always been good. Mine have always been better than a lot of the people that I was working with, like in the doctoral program, but that's because I had all that background as a public speaker and as a broadcaster. Most people don't have that. Most people don't have that built-up understanding of here's how you talk in front of a group of people, here's how you try to engage people. And so you're learning that on the fly while also learning how to translate information into a format that's going to be useful for students. And so I think what I took out of it, because my early evaluations weren't great either, a lot of it was really based around this idea of, okay, there's certain things that I'm falling down on that I need to know about and be conscious of, and that's where the evaluations do help. But for so many people who are in academia, especially those first couple of teaching evaluations, it's something you learn to dread. And I think it actually ends up creating an adversarial relationship in the mind of a professor between themselves and the students, until you get to a point where you understand that what you're doing in the classroom doesn't have to be a judgment on you, but instead is a referendum on how well you're presenting things. And I know that might sound like the same thing, but it's really a very different concept.
Yeah, I think as I've grown as a teacher, I recognize that this sounds kind of selfish to think about, but it's like never really been about me. And therefore I can reduce or separate my self-worth, right, from what students' perceptions are of me and focus instead on what is the feedback that they're giving that I can make changes with, and how can I make those changes? And some of it you don't always agree with, right? Sometimes you're like, yeah, no, I know you don't want to read. Like, I get it, but you have to.
Right.
But can I reframe why we do things so that the next year students don't look at that as Dr. Aiken just wants us to do too much? And can I cut down on some things, right? Am I thinking about, are all of these necessary? Like, that changed it from being about you're not a good teacher to being about this formative feedback loop. And then when you actually complete the loop, it becomes a meaningful experience, which is where I think, especially as new faculty, but even as faculty who've been teaching for 10 years, like really thinking about how you mentally approach those evaluations, and not only how you approach them when you read them, but how you approach them when you tell students it's time to take them.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I'll add before we get started with that aspect is like something to keep in mind from where do evaluations sit within the big scheme of things? What I've always tried to get my mind wrapped around is the idea that the evaluations really exist within the confines of a continuum of whatever your teaching performance happens to be. And I think it's actually perhaps the friendliest of the feedback loops that you encounter in academia. The problem with academia feedback loops is they're normally mean on purpose. Like they're intended to make you feel like less of a human being. So your research is getting criticized, or your service is getting criticized, or you're being told, well, what you're doing is not right and you should do this thing instead. And I would actually argue that teaching evaluations, there's a lot of the kind of purposeful mean girls approach that we see in academia from other professionals and colleagues isn't there among the students. The students are reacting in a way that's more akin to like people buying things on Amazon. And you have to understand that they're going to react to the product being put in front of them in the classroom. Most of the time, they're not going to negatively respond to something that is actually positive. They're going to respond to things that could be better, and they're judging that based upon the other classes that they're taking. So you have to kind of think about it from the standpoint of being almost like a service provider in the classroom. And the evaluations are essentially the review that somebody fills out after they purchased the product and gotten it on an online site. So, that's a lot of people are not comfortable with thinking about teaching that way, but that's really what you're doing. If you think about it, you've got those students for 30 or 32 class sessions. You've set up a syllabus that's a contract with them. You're supposed to deliver X, Y, and Z, and it's not just what you deliver. A lot of times it's how you deliver it. And I think a lot of people get caught up and they get bad reviews, and they're like, well, they're giving good reviews to teachers that are just being nice to them, and I'm actually telling them how it is. And a lot of times that's not really how it is at all. Some of the best evaluations I've gotten have been in classes where I've pushed the students really hard, but you have to understand what audience it is. And you have to be able to structure the class in a way that's going to be something that students want to receive. And this is where I think if you can properly explain what the class is about, if you can lay out what you're going to do and why you're doing it, and you can help students understand the framework within which that is happening, you're generally going to get off to a good start in terms of the evaluations, because now you've put the class in a field of meaning that you've created. You're not just leaving it to the students to place it in a field of meaning that they are creating.
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important point. And it ties back to some of the things we've talked about is just, we sometimes assume students know know why we're doing what we're doing, or know the purpose of the class, or what have you. And sometimes we have to tell them and connect those dots, because then when it comes time to evaluate it, they're thinking about it in the way that we intended it to happen. And then they can maybe even give us better or more specific evaluation of the things that we're doing. They can say, you know what, Dr. Aiken, you said that your goal for this class was for us to think about sport from this perspective other than a fan. And I didn't really get that with this assignment. I could have gotten it this way. But if they didn't know that that was why I included these podcasts or whatever it is that made them listen or listen to the Sport Business Journal podcast, then they don't know that that's the purpose, and they might just think it's busy work. And then they're going to tell me in my evaluation, Dr. Aiken makes us do busy work. But if I tell them why it's not busy work, I might still get that. But it does help maybe frame for them what they can focus their feedback on.
Yeah. Well, you keep in mind, going back to the Amazon review metaphor, there's really only two types of people that fill out reviews. There's people who really love the product, and there's people that really hate the product. And in academia, I think a lot of times we get caught up in the idea that students are going to automatically come in and hate whatever we're giving them, that they don't want to learn, they don't want to be there. But I would say in many disciplines, including the ones that you and I teach in sport marketing and in sports media, most of those students want to be there. They want to learn. They want to understand things. And I think we're a lot I read a ton of evaluations as an administrator, and one of the things I notice consistently in other people's evaluations is the people that get the best evaluations have generally done three things. A, going back to what I said earlier, they've properly framed the class and what it's going to provide and why the things that they're doing in the class matter in search of the ultimate learning objectives that you've got in the class. That's really important. And a lot of times I think faculty, particularly older faculty, kind of feel like they don't have to justify what they're doing in the class or why it's being done that way. But your students this year are going to be completely different from your students the previous year or the year before or 5 years before or 10 years before. You do have to constantly justify what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it's useful, how it applies, not just to that class, but also to the larger trajectory of their learning in whatever major they're in. The second thing that I find that most faculty that get good evaluations do is that they give consistent feedback that is deep enough that students feel like they're getting something for their work. So like going back to the busy work stuff, the complaints that I'll get is like, well, there were too many readings and they didn't necessarily tie into X, Y, or Z. And that's where you need to go out of your way to make sure that what you're providing them has some kind of a logical point to it, and that you're giving them feedback on the materials that they're turning in, and that you are able to connect some of the things that they read and then put back hopefully in the paper or the exam or whatever into that. And I think the people that don't do that end up getting a lot of questions and complaints like, well, why did we do this? It really wasn't clear. The third thing I think is you have to be yourself. And so much of being a teacher, like I teach, I've never watched you teach before. I've watched you present. That just happened an hour ago. So I have a general idea of what you would be like when you teach. You and I teach in a similar style. It's very conversational. You throw in anecdotes at random intervals. You try to bring students in occasionally into the conversation to get them feeling like they're part of it. You try to solicit questions, then you bring it back to a main point. Not everybody can do that effectively. The worst thing you can do in a classroom, and the thing that will have the most negative impact on your evaluations, is you try to do something that you're not, or even worse, you don't make efforts to bridge a connection between yourself and the students in some way. It doesn't mean you have to be like their best buddy or you have to be like an entertainer, but there has to be some rationale for the delivery. And this is something I learn in media all the time and talk about in media. It's like you can have a great message, but if you don't have an effective messaging vehicle, in this case, the way that you're acting in the classroom, after a while, people are going to start tuning it out because it's just not, it's like if there's a television program that's interesting, but it's got a really boring narrator, you're probably going to turn it off eventually.
Right. And I think that authenticity piece is so important because so many of us, when we become teachers, because again, we don't get training, right? We're focusing on who taught us that we thought were a good teacher. How can I replicate the things that they did, both in their mannerisms in the classroom and in the assignments and the way that they talk to students? And sometimes those things we're not comfortable, we're not authentic. So then we come off a little bit unsure, and then students see that and they read it, and in the evaluation, it starts to, they start to think about, well, was I comfortable with this teacher and the way that they were delivering the content? They didn't seem knowledgeable because we're trying to be something we're not.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good recommendation as you think about how to present yourself as a teacher to avoid having student feedback be so focused on, your personal qualities.
Well, a lot of it's just confidence.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to get to. And, what I see with a lot of younger professors now, and lecturers too, who are just getting started in the process, is if you don't come in with the level of self-confidence in your ability to be a presenter, to teach things in a classroom setting, it is easy to kind of back yourself into a corner where you're not doing the little things in addition to the actual lecturing or whatever setup your class has that makes the class feel worthwhile. And that's where, again, it's like not everybody is a great personality in the classroom. Not everybody feels comfortable with trying to inject energy into the classroom with the way that they teach. But there's other ways to go about it where, we've got very droll, relatively low-key people who still get good evaluations because, again, they're able to present something where students feel like there's a value proposition coming back to them. And I think this is something that we didn't worry about too much 25 years ago because for a lot of academics in the classroom, it was like, well, the students have to be here. I don't need to justify what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. This is the method that works because I'm the expert. Well, that's not really how academia works these days. It's really about, do the students feel like they're getting something out of the equation? And again, they're more likely to fill out evaluations if they feel like they've gotten something good out of it, or if they feel like they haven't gotten something good out of it. And so, part of your job is to make sure that that first group of students does feel like they're getting something satisfied. And then for the second group of students, can you make the class more compelling, either through what's being presented or how it connects to the larger learning objectives, or in how you yourself are presenting it? That will tend to tip those people from that second group into the first group. And I think that's an important process that sometimes takes the entire 15 or 16 weeks.
Definitely. And I do think we should circle back to something that you said, because this is very similar to product reviews or, on social media, people comment on stuff because they love it or they hate it. The middle ground you hear very little from. And some of the problem, you mentioned the feedback loop. You take those evaluations, you look at them as formative, you make decisions for a class based on the polar ends, when maybe the assignment actually wasn't bad and people mostly valued it, but you didn't hear from those people. So one of the things I think is really important is your setup to your students when you tell them about the evaluation. And one of the things that I typically make sure that I do is tell them that I actually use the feedback. That seems so basic, right? But I say, we're doing faculty evaluations. I understand that this might not be something that is highly valuable to you, but it is highly valuable to me. Let me give you some examples of ways I've used evaluations in the past to make changes in this course. And I'll give them an example of something that a student told me that I did to try to build some of that buy-in to, even if you are in the middle ground, tell me how you felt about the course. And usually, and not every university allows this, most places I've been do, you can put some of your own questions in there. And so I will either tell students, I've added a couple questions that ask you the most effective thing for this course for your learning and something that you would change and tell me why. And if the university doesn't allow you to do that, the open-ended comments, you can specifically tell the students, I would love to know, and I want to know because of this. Most of the time, I think we have such a negative relationship as faculty with the student evaluations. I'm sure you've sat in promotion and tenure committees where people are like, why do we even use those? Students can't evaluate teaching. That's worthless. And so we have a negative perspective of this. And so we just here, fill these out if you want to or not. I'll leave the room for 10 minutes and I'll be back. And then you can't be surprised if a student rails on you in that evaluation, because you're not giving them a very good setup for whether this is even useful. And they're using it as a place to air grievances, which isn't helpful because you've, and I have gotten, even with this setup, by the way, I have gotten grievances in there.
Sure.
And the most frustrating thing as a faculty is you don't get to explain oh, I'm so, I wish you had told me that before, because I could have fixed that and before week 15, before we got here. But you have to, give them opportunities for those grievances elsewhere so that that's not what's coming out on your evaluation, and do the setup of the evaluation as well.
Well, one of the things I always recommend, particularly to younger faculty, but I would also recommend it to any faculty member who is concerned or uncertain about both the quality and the quantity of the evaluations that they might receive at the end of a semester. Do a midterm evaluation off the books. You don't have to use, a lot of times you can't use the regular system that your university is using, but use Google Forms. Create something where students can submit anonymous feedback and say, I'm legitimately interested in how you folks think the class is going. Give me good feedback. Give me feedback on things you think needs to be improved. Give me anything that you think is a major red flag. That can both prime students for filling out the evaluations at the end of semester, but it can also give you a chance to address some things that have piled up in the first half of the class with a certain number of students who might not like something that's going on. And I think that's useful, and I actually think that kind of defrays, in some cases, the vitriol that you might get in a class where you're potentially getting bad evaluations. It's well, at least you gave them a chance to comment on it earlier. Now, you do have to take those things seriously. You have to, if you've got multiple people saying, there's too much writing and we don't understand why, or the grading is too harsh, or things like that, you need to be prepared to, at the very least, address to the class in general, okay, here's why this is happening the way that it's happening. And again, it feels like to me a lot of the problems that faculty have with evaluations is faculty generally don't like to be judged by other people, let alone by people they don't perceive as their peers or
Right.
superiors. And yet, the reality is student evaluations and the way that students feel about what's going on in the classroom are very important to the overall conduct of what we're doing educationally at the university. And so, giving people more opportunities, not less, but also priming the pump, so to speak, and trying to get them in the mindset of, I'm going to ask you questions about how this class is going. I invite your feedback. You're not going to get punished for it. This will give us a chance to maybe hit the reset button if there are problems. It also allows me internally, even if you're having relatively good times in the class, if a bunch of people say, hey, we really don't like this, maybe you know something that you didn't know, and now you can have time to fix it, and you're not only hearing about it on the final evaluations.
That's one of my favorite methods, I think, and one of the things that it's super easy to do. I mean, Google Forms, it's going to take you 3 minutes to set up, and even asking 4 or 5 questions about how engaged do they feel during class, what activities do they like, what assignments are difficult and why. And even if you get, very little feedback, part of what we need to do is show that we're willing to ask for feedback and that we care about their perspective and opinions. And then when those end of semester evaluations roll around, we've talked about this in a few episodes, Galen, that rapport is so important. And this opportunity to give feedback and be heard builds rapport with students. You're not going to be able to fix everything. And sometimes, I've had students say, I hate group assignments. Well, we are doing that. But let's have a conversation about why you hate group assignments. And then maybe I should add in a contract where you and the group get together and talk about what group behaviors, what can I do to help defray that concern? Because I'm not going to take that assignment out at this point in the semester. And I've been doing those since I started teaching midterm evaluations. And I've made changes to classes in the middle of the class. And I can't, I don't have evidence to show if that avoided some other perspectives that might have come out in teaching evaluations, but I do know for certain that students felt like I respected them because I cared about their opinions. And it seems silly, that something as simple as asking somebody what they think can provide that mutual respect. And we're younger-ish faculty.
Thank you.
Younger-ish. I'm giving us both that. And maybe 30 years ago, faculty, there was a different dynamic. We don't live in that world, but that's the dynamic in higher education. And whether you started teaching this semester or you've been teaching for 30 years, you have to consider the dynamic of the students that you're teaching and how they want to be treated as in that mutual respect. And what's great about that, and this is not the point of this episode, but what's great about that is 10 years down the road, you get to have a relationship with those students because you were willing to have it when they were quote unquote, your under, your students that you were like a superior of, or you were leading, but it becomes more of right away, it becomes more of a partnership and a shared learning experience. And I just think that pays dividends years down the road.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, ultimately, again, I think so much of it comes down to, it depends on the type of class. It's harder in a large scale class, I think, to get the kind of equilibrium that you would need to have all positive reviews all the time, because that's oftentimes a very boring and difficult way to go through a class where you're just lecturing. But if you can make the topics and the things that you're covering very interesting, sometimes you can overcome that. If you can present the material in an entertaining manner, perhaps you can overcome that. A lot of getting students to fill out evaluations in those cases with those large scale classes, it really does come down to, hey, we really want to get evaluation from you. I want to hear what you thought about the class and the way that the material was presented, and also use the qualitative comment box to let us know what else you'd like to see or hear. And that, to me, even in a small scale class where you're given a lot of one-on-one, people react well to being made to feel like they're part of an overall process, not the final decider, but hey, I'm able to contribute to this and I'm able to reflect on what I learned in the classroom based upon a variety of different factors. All these things I think are really helpful, but you have to think about it in that way. And this is where I think to some degree, what I'm always fascinated by with human psychology is we have this tendency to break out into in groups and out groups. And as faculty, your out group is generally the students, and it's students, they don't know this or that, they hate this or that, they're not doing that. And it's like, you got to get out of that mentality.
Yeah.
And I think what you'll find is that one of the things that can positively affect your teaching evaluations is stop thinking of the students as an adversary to overcome.
Yep.
And more as like a part of the class that you're teaching. And every class is going to be a little bit different. You're going to have different personalities for classes as a whole. You're going to have different people talking. How can I, in the first couple of weeks, identify what type of class this is and what kinds of things do I need to provide? I mean, I have one adjunct that worked for me for like 7 or 8 years. Probably our most popular instructor in terms of the numbers. And the comments I get on this instructor over and over again are how much they care and how much they give feedback and how much they will sit down and talk individually with students. And yet even with that instructor, I've had situations where I'll get, they'll have all 5s and there'll be like a 1 or a 2 1s. And I'll read and I can tell like where the negative comments are coming from and they're tied to that. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with their teaching ability. It has to do with a grade dispute,
Yep.
or it has to do with something that happened in the class where the instructor laid the law down like they should, and the student decides that they're going to take it out on the instructor in the evaluative process. And I think my message is, to some degree, there's nothing you can do about that.
Yep.
You can't make everybody happy, nor should you be trying to. Mm-hmm. But what you can do is create an environment where the majority of the people in the class not only feel empowered in the process of evaluating the class, but also feel an affinity and some kind of a direct tie to what happened in the class. They feel like they were a part of it,
Yep.
not just that it was stuff that was being shot at them twice a week for 75 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And especially you cannot make everyone happy. I mean, as a marketer, right, there's groups that are just not going to like anything that you do or any product that you create, and there's not much you can do about that. You can try to reach them, you can try to address it, but it's not going to happen.
Right.
I think, from an administrator perspective on your end, one of the things that I was worried about early on in my career is when I get those students, when I get like 5s and then these couple 1s and their comment section is just horrible. You were worried this goes into your tenure and promotion or your annual evaluation, and how is administrator going to look at that?
And this is, unfortunately, you never know. This is where I get it. This is the part of the podcast where Galen gets into trouble, but I'll say, like, I've had a lot of administrators over the course of time that I've worked under who really didn't understand teaching.
Yeah.
They had to teach as part of their jobs, but they were researchers by trade, and all they really knew about or cared about was the qualitative numbers. And I've had situations with adjuncts where, like, we'll have one semester and the evaluations will be kind of mid, and they'll be like, well, we can't hire them again. And I'm like, why? I'm like, well, they didn't get very good evaluations. It's like, it's their first semester teaching, and in many cases it's a new class for them. It's like, you got to give people a little bit of time to round into shape and to understand what that evaluative process looks like, and also to understand what the classroom environment's like. And I think, as a aspiring baby doc, assistant professor somewhere, you might be paranoid about some bad feedback. One class, or even a small subset of a class that has negative things to say, if you're working for good administrators, should not be disqualifying or a real problem. Because at the end of the day, unless you are a teaching faculty member, that's probably a very minor thing that's being evaluated in the totality of your tenure and promotion documents. But what you have to think about is, if it's happening over and over again and there's clear patterns developing, you would think, okay, that's the problem. But a lot of administrators, when they're doing reviews, aren't looking systematically at all of your feedback. They're just looking at the 1 year, which actually ends up being a big beneficial. And again, I've never heard of a tenure track faculty member getting fired because of bad teaching evaluations, because generally speaking, again, that's not what they're there for. Lecturers, different story, but I also have found that lecturers are generally a lot more on the spot with getting in there, figuring out how to handle the teaching environment and developing a style that works best for them.
And one thing that I was told when I started back a while back at Illinois State was, Yeah, we look at your student teaching evaluations, we look at the numbers, but we look at the qualitative feedback. And if a student is saying, things that are, oh, this was too much work or this was too hard, we're not concerned about that. We know that not all students are going to like the style or the assignments or the way that you grade. We look for, like you said, patterns. And then, at a good institution, when you go up for tenure or annual review, you get to write a letter. And my recommendation always to faculty is, if you got some poor teaching evaluations, address why you think it is. That was the best advice I got. And I said, my first 2 semesters, I said, I think part of the reason I'm getting poor teaching evaluations is I am new at this. These are new classes. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect from the students, and I got it wrong and I didn't know how to adjust. I'm learning how to adjust. Here's the things I'm planning to do to address the negative feedback I got. And then you're not gonna get fired for that or not a reappointment.
Everybody loves a growth narrative.
That's right. And when in doubt, go to the growth narrative. But it does show that you're at least, and hopefully you're being authentic about it.
Well, that's the thing.
Right. Hopefully you're actually going to think about and do the things.
Part of the problem with a lot of our educational system for PhDs is that pedagogy is not a required course in most cases. And even in the places where it's an option, a lot of times the pedagogy is built around how to teach graduate level classes as opposed to teaching undergraduates, which is really where you're going to get the vast majority of your teaching reviews. So look, you've just got to understand that the teaching evaluations are part of the process. You need to take them seriously because you need to take your teaching seriously, even if it only counts for 20% of your promotion and tenure case. And if you're a lecturer, obviously it's going to count a lot more than that, so you need to put even more emphasis on it. But this is where you need to take advantage. If you're getting dinged, it's like, this is a boring, these classes are boring, or the instructor doesn't talk in a way that makes sense, or the assignments are bad. Leverage your teaching and learning opportunities on campus. Leverage those organizations. Put that in your growth narrative and say, I got bad feedback initially. And so I went to my teaching and learning center on campus and I asked them to walk me through, well, how do I avoid these things in the future? And I made alterations and I got better evaluations after that. That's really all anybody's looking for. I guess my big take-home point, maybe what we can finish on, is what I don't want people to do if you get bad evaluations is think, well, students suck. I can't trust students. Students are my adversary. They're out to get me. No one's out to get you. Like the students don't sit there and think, oh, I'm going to go give this person bad evaluations going into the class. Students generally just want to go in, have a good experience. And generally, if they have criticisms, there's normally a point to them. And if it's like, well, if you're saying, well, this is just how I do things and I'm getting evaluated poorly on them, you may want to reevaluate how you're doing things because it might be a little out of step with best practices for teaching in the current day and age.
Yeah, I do think that's a great way to end it. I especially appreciate your advice from the administrator perspective about the things that you see in positive teaching evaluations, what some of those similarities are. And if you are out there and you're not doing a midterm evaluation, that's something that's really small. Will take you 10 minutes to create, 10 minutes to talk about in class or send via email, probably both, and maybe 10 minutes to look at. Share with the students what you learned from that, and then talk through what you were thinking about doing, or make it a conversation about what they think you should do to address the feedback. Because again, that's including them. Those are really small things you can do, maybe not this semester because we're a little late in this semester for a midterm evaluation. But honestly, for some of us, we have 5 or 6 weeks left. It might be worth it, especially if you can't get a good feel for the class when you're physically in it. Some classes I've had students look at me the whole time like I thought they hated the class, and then at the end it was like the best class they've ever taken.
Yeah.
So you can't always judge it based on body language. So I would really recommend that you do that and even search out some opportunities on your campus for teaching evaluations from external people in teaching and learning to have them come look at your class. You can also, at some universities, have them come in and lead a listening session with your students without you there. They facilitate it. They give you the feedback. That could be a really great option, especially if you're worried students won't fill out the online form or won't believe it's anonymous. I would definitely encourage you to look for those opportunities. Okay, with that, thank you for joining us for episode 5. And if you have any comments or questions that you want us to talk about in upcoming podcasts, please let us know in the comments.